This is Mr. Krabs Realistic, and this is a list of the most famous cartoon characters. I'm going to turn 3 of them realistic, and since SpongeBob is my favorite cartoon, I'm turning them as realistic and cursed as possible. Stick around because this is going to be torture for the characters, not for me of course. So first things first, I started finding stock images for SpongeBob. I needed a sponge texture and some eyeballs. Finally, I can now start adding a simple mask from the reference and cover the layer with this sponge texture that I found, which by the way, I found this sponge texture in 4K from this random free website. As you can see on the bottom left of the screen, I have this timer set up because I wanted to see how long it takes me to complete something like this. This was my first time making something like this, even though I've been using Photoshop for 3 years. Anyways, after I finished masking out the sponge, I started adding some of the details of the face. Now, this is where it starts to become quite difficult because I only have 2 stock images that I'm using here. One being just a sponge texture and the second and final being just the eyeballs. Everything else that you see, the mouth, teeth, the nose, everything has to be shaded in. Now before we do that, I start adding the eyeballs, and this is where, I started struggling a little bit with the eyeballs because they looked very weird when I put them together at first because they couldn't fit. So what I had to do was I just had to tinker a bit and get the eyeballs fixed and right shape. His eyes are really ginormous, almost reminds me of something else. The eyes looked in place, so I moved on to creating the mouth and found this totally normal picture of a human tongue. So I decided to cut the tongue and place it inside SpongeBob's mouth. I can't believe the sentence I just said. This is where I become Houdini and made the nose and inside the mouth without any stock images. It took a lot of shading, and while I was doing this, you will never guess what I just realized. SpongeBob has no lips. I don't know how Anyways, before I get lost into my intrusive thoughts, I started shading in these tiny holes that SpongeBob has. I'm not sure how he isn't in constant pain and agony while having this many holes or whatever he has. After this, I added SpongeBob's clothes because otherwise he'd be naked, and started refining this overall his body. All that was left was the environment, and found stock images of sand and water and the pineapple, which I put together to create Bikini Bottom. After doing some final refinements, this is how it turned out. I overall liked how SpongeBob turned out, but knowing the next few characters that I'm going to do and how challenging they're going to be, I'm looking forward to doing them. Next up is our friendly neighborhood menace, Patrick. I specifically chose this picture of Patrick for reference because once I'm done, I knew that Patrick would look cursed. After doing a basic selection and mask, I quickly realized how was I going to turn Patrick's pink skin realistic. You see, SpongeBob was easy since I could just, use a sponge, but Patrick's a different breed as we know. So after doing some brainstorming, I found this texture of actual human skin, which I can Frankenstein together with Photoshop to create a realistic skin for Patrick. Bro, someone could use this video as evidence to put me inside a cycle. No, not even joking. Then I started putting the skin layers inside the mask and used warp to make it fit. Obviously, using just a texture wasn't going to be enough. So I started working on the face using the same eye image that I found earlier for SpongeBob and put it together. I immediately started working on shading because this was going to be definitely the most difficult process, as I'm also just using a mouse and a keyboard to paint. I also added Patrick's creepy smile, can't forget that. Almost finishing up, I made sure our boy isn't naked. I added his sweatpants or whatever those are. At this point, I had been staring at Patrick's face for an hour, so to finish off, I added the environment and did some final touches, and this is how Patrick turned out. I enjoyed a lot more making this Patrick realistic thing because it was a lot more challenging, creating the shadows. I was using my mouse to create the shadows. If you Photoshop, you know how difficult it is to paint stuff. So I actually enjoyed this a lot more because this is an area that I lack. The final character is Squidward, and I wanted to challenge myself further by doing handsome Squidward. This is going to be, by far, out of the 2 characters that I've done so far, this is going to be the most difficult because shading and painting is going to be 90% of the process for this character. After doing the selection, I immediately started putting shading in places. I used again the same eye image that I found earlier. I kept going back and forth from the Squidward reference picture to make sure that I can align the areas where his face has wrinkles and facial features. Oh, and can't forget his lips. even though they looked kinda like a butthole by the time I was finished doing that. Oh, also, how can I forget? I wanted to make his chin very Chad. Can we just take a moment to appreciate his jawline, because bro's a cartoon and he has better jawline than you. Couldn't be me, totally. Anyways, at this point I had basically put Squidward's facial features in place and had soft shadows to make it clear for myself so I can move on to creating hard shadows. You know, when an object doesn't have light hitting it, it appears much darker. So I wanted to use this to my advantage and make Squidward look more 3D and realistic, to resemble a tired look. I also went ahead and used some of the human skin texture I found earlier. I was struggling a while to make the nose look decent, but eventually figured a way to make it decent, I guess. I made Squidward's eye bags dark on purpose to run with the whole gimmick that Squidward has depression or whatever he has. And as things were going smooth, of course, my Photoshop decided to crash not once, but 3 times, losing like 30 minutes worth of progress. But that wasn't going to stop me. I finished adding Squidward's clothes and added this concrete texture on top of all the stuff, added an underwater environment and a camera raw filter, and this is how it turned out.